I love my home arcade, and while it's not very big, it does hold 6 or 7 smaller games fairly comfortably. That is, until a couple of months ago when I couldn't pass up Walmart's $3.99 Simpson deal. With the arrival of this 4-player Arcade1Up game, I quietly moved 2 of my other machines into my wife's workout room, thinking she'd never notice. Obviously, I was mistaken, so I had to come up with a better solution fast. Previously, I'd worked with Adrian at GrafixArcade to make a custom 2-player conversion deck for my 4-player Golden Axe game. That conversion worked so well that GrafixArcade now offers the 2-player Golden Axe deck for sale on Etsy.com. So, I went straight back to Adrian for help on my Simpsons project. Unlike the Golden Axe conversion, however, where any player can play any character, Simpsons uses dedicated controls for each. Marge is always player 1, Homer is always player 2, and so on. And while you could pick 2 of your favorite characters and ignore the others to build a workable 2-player machine, I didn't want to do that as I enjoy playing all of them. Working off the theory that I could rewire a joystick with a splitter to operate 2 characters per player station, I had Adrian build me a custom 2-player deck for my Simpsons game, then set to work figuring out how to install it in the cabinet. I'll warn you up front that this is not as easy as my other Arcade1Up conversion projects on YouTube, but as long as you take your time and work carefully, it's not difficult either. Also, keep in mind GrafixArcade made this deck as a custom piece for me. I believe Adrian plans to offer these for sale eventually, but they might differ from what I used. The wiring work, however, will likely be the same. To do this project, you'll need all of the components from the original deck. So to start, I removed the 4-player deck from the machine and its plastic dust cover. Before doing anything else, I took detailed photos of the wiring. Photos are a great reference for putting it all back together, and I did need them before I was done. The wiring runs are bundled together with zip ties, and I cut them with wire cutters to free the wires. All connections to the circuit board are made with JST plugs. Arcade1Up applied glue to some of these to keep them from working loose in transit, but they came free easily enough using a pair of needle-nose pliers. The buttons are held to the deck with 2 locking tabs. To remove a button, press the tabs inward and push the button through the hole. To release the joysticks, I first removed the 6 mounting screws and then heated the glue that holds the mounting plate to the deck with a hairdryer. I pried the plate loose with a stiff putty knife. The trackball housing is also glued in place. After removing the 4 screws, I applied gentle upward pressure with a putty knife on the mounting ears until the glue pulled away. It did take a bit of the MDF with it. From there, I removed the screws holding the circuit board, the headset jack, and the on and off volume switch assemblies. Arcade1Up uses superglue to hold the 3 plastic bezels for these parts to the deck, so they're a little bit difficult to remove without damaging them. As I worked, I put all of the screws and small parts into containers to have them ready for installation later. The next step was to test the GrafixArcade deck. It's made from plywood and comes with the vinyl and edge trim already installed. It also includes a plexiglass deck protector. I placed the new deck into the cabinet for a test fit, and as shown without the original deck's dust cover, there's a 2-inch gap at the bottom of the deck between it and the front panel of the cabinet. While Adrian included a taller replacement panel, part of the housing of the trackball would still need to sit outside of it. Since the original game had a plastic dust cover to protect the trackball and the wiring, I decided to do something similar here by building a simple wooden box under the deck and keep the shorter panel. For the sides of the box, I cut a clear pine 1x3 down to 2 inches wide on my table saw. I then cut a piece 17 5/8 inches long for the front and 2 2.5-inch pieces for the ends. I placed 45-degree miters at the corners, and then I attached these parts to the deck using wood glue and clamps. I let the glue dry for an hour, then removed the clamps and tested the deck again to get an accurate measurement for the bottom plate. I cut the plate from a piece of 3/16 inch hardboard and made it 2 1/8 inches deep by 17 5/8 inches long. It needs to be removable to get to the trackball, so it's held in place by 5 3/4 inch screws. Next, I removed the yellow T-molding from the deck and I painted the new dust cover as well as any exposed parts on the underside with black acrylic semi-gloss paint. With the trackball cover figured out, I turned my attention to setting up the first of the 2-player positions. You've probably noticed that the character placement on my 2-player deck does not correspond to those on the original. The character combinations I play most often with my wife and friends are Homer and Marge, Homer and Bart, or Bart and Lisa. As such, I had Adrian place Homer and Lisa together on the left player position and Marge and Bart on the right. While the character stats still appear at the top of the screen in the original order, since making this modification, no one who has played the game has had any trouble with it. To keep the changes in the character placement straight while working under the deck, I penciled in all of the information on the buttons and their openings. To modify the joysticks so that they could be used with two-player positions, I salvaged all of the 4-pin JST plugs and approximately 6 inches of wire from the 2 spare units. I wired the plugs to the 2 remaining joysticks using insulation displacement connectors, also called IDCs or suitcase connectors. There are a number of options for IDCs, but I prefer Scotchlok 558 red connectors, as they have a double blade providing not one, but 2 electrical connections to the wires and making them almost foolproof. You need to work carefully here to make sure the wires you connect are in the proper sequence, or you may inadvertently wire your joystick with a closed switch. You'll know if you do, as you'll have a character that keeps moving when the joystick is at rest. I started with the first yellow wire from each plug and joined them to an IDC before doing the next. The IDCs are easy to use. Insert the unbroken wire into the side slot, then click the side door closed. Next, insert the joining wire into the remaining hole in the IDC until you can see it in the small window. Use a pair of pliers set to their wide jaw setting and crimp the metal blades down until they are flush with the top. Finally, snap the door closed to protect the connection. I did all connections on the first joystick exactly like this. At this point, I began to assemble the new deck. I installed the power and volume switches first. The plastic bezels slip into the board from the front and lock into place with 2 pressure tabs from the back. The power and volume switches have plastic knobs that slip over the tops, and then the whole assembly fits into the cutouts in the deck board. It's held in place with 3 screws. The headset jack mounts similarly. I installed the bezel first, and then the jack screws in from the back. Next, I replaced the circuit board and installed the Live Online button. I also installed the trackball. I used acrylic caulk to give it extra hold, as well as replaced the original Arcade1Up screws with number 8 half-inch screws for a more secure fit. I then made the first wiring connections to the board, plugging in the Live button, the power and volume connections, the trackball wires, and the headset. All of these are marked clearly on the circuit board. From there, I installed the blue Homer player buttons. The buttons have a centering bump along one side that corresponds to the notch cut into the buttonhole. Line up the bump and press the button into the hole until you hear the locking tabs click into place. Regardless of where they are located on the deck, Homer's buttons must plug into the player 2 position on the circuit board. I plugged the start button into the start 2 socket, and then I plugged the jump button into G2B and the attack button into G2A. Next, I installed the Homer side joystick. The arrow on the joystick mounting plate points towards the screen for correct alignment. After centering the joystick in its hole, I taped the plate to the deck board to temporarily hold it. I then used an awl to make starter holes in the soft wood and drove the screws in place with my drill. I plugged one of the black and yellow 4-pin joystick plugs into the G2 right-left socket. I plugged the green and red joystick plug into the G2 up-down socket. Using the other set of joystick plugs, I connected them to the player 4 position for Lisa. The black and yellow plug goes into the G4 right-left socket, and the green and red plug goes into the G4 up-down socket. With the joystick complete, I installed the yellow buttons in the left side player position for Lisa. I connected the wires to the player 4 position on the circuit board using Start 4 for the player button, G4B for the jump button, and G4A for the attack button. With one half of the deck complete, I installed it in the cabinet and fired up the game to test the connections. The joystick worked as it should for both Lisa and Homer, and all buttons functioned correctly. I then removed the deck and cleaned up all the wiring with zip ties. I repeated all of these steps for the right-hand side, installing the red buttons for Marge and the green buttons for Bart, as well as the single joystick with splitter cables. Marge is the player 1 position on the circuit board, while Bart is the player 3 position. From there, I reassembled the cabinet for a final time and conducted some extensive playtesting, making sure that the joystick motions were correct for all characters, as well as that the player buttons and the trackball functioned as they should. I then moved the game back into my arcade and did some much-needed reorganizing. While I don't usually use the online feature for Simpsons, I conducted some tests with a friend who has the same Arcade1Up X-Men cabinet I have. If Simpsons works the same way X-Men does, once you select a character and a player position, the game locks out any input for that station from any other game. So, the spliced joysticks should not cause a problem using the online feature. When I find someone I know with the Simpsons game, I'll put it to an extensive test. Thanks to Adrian at GrafixArcade for all his help on this project. You can find out more about his line of 2-player conversion decks by visiting his Etsy store. The joystick splitting technique I show here should also work for Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and he already offers a 2-player deck for that game. For more of my easier arcade mod projects, check out my YouTube channel, PoppArtStudios.